We want all Grenadians to know. We want all Grenadians remember. August 1st, 1838, slavery ended in Grenada.
Slavery
Slavery
ended
ended
in
in Grenada.
Grenada.
Slavery ended in Grenada. August 1st, 1838, slavery ended in Grenada. Nearly 2 centuries now have gone since emancipation was born. So we call on the whole nation, come recognize emancipation. So we call on the whole nation, yes, we call on the whole nation. We call on the whole nation, come recognize emancipation.
We call on the whole nation, come celebrate emancipation.
Our featured speaker is Dr. Bright Gyamfi. His topic is The African Struggle is Our Struggle, the African Dimensions of the Grenadian Revolution. Dr. Bright Gyamfi is an assistant professor of history at Rutgers University in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Dr. Gyamfi served on the faculty at the University of California, San Diego before joining Rutgers. He was a former presidential fellow at Northwestern University. His research sits at the intersection of West African and African diaspora intellectual history, nationalism, Pan-Africanism, Black internationalism, and economic development. Dr. Gyamfi writes on African intellectuals who worked to transform and radicalize the study of Africa in academic and intellectual centers around the Atlantic. He has received research fellowships and grants from several organizations and institutions, including the Social Science Research Council. He was a Fulbright Scholar with the U.S. Department of State's Benjamin A. Gilman International Scholarship Program. He has received fellowships from Northwestern University, the University of Oxford, and the University of Notre Dame. His work has appeared in the Journal of African American History, African Studies Review, Africa is a Country and the Conversation. Dr. Gyamfi holds a BA in History with honors and Political Science from the University of Notre Dame, an MSc in African Studies from the University of Oxford, and a PhD in History from Northwestern University. The African Struggle is Our Struggle, the African Dimensions of the Grenadian Revolution, Dr. Bright Gyamfi.
Thank you so much, Judy, for such a lovely introduction. Before we begin, I would love to thank the organizers, the Institute for People's Enlightenment, the University of West Indies Global Campus, Grenada, and once again, accept my sincere apologies that I could not be with you in person. As has already been mentioned, today's topic is entitled The African Struggle is Our Struggle, African Intellectuals, the Grenadian Revolution, and the Politics of History Making. What happens to anti-colonial ideas once an anti-colonial government falls is a question that as an intellectual and political historian of Africa, I've been preoccupied with this question as I've embarked on my current book project tentatively entitled The Embers of Pan-Africanism. So today's talk, I just want to give us a brief overview. I will start off talking about the genesis of my book project from which this talk stems from, define key concepts, most notably enchromanism, highlight the arguments and the interventions that the book seeks to make, as well as provide a broader context in which these intellectuals whose work I discuss move and live through. And today's discussion will mostly be geared towards chapter 6 of the book, and I will end with a conclusion and broader questions for thinking about emancipation. So I take us to Ghana in 2018. I went back to Ghana to do research at the Institute of African Studies. While there, I came across a file titled Nana Kobnan Ketia. However, I did not know who this intellectual was, nor was his name a popular figure in Ghana's current imagination. However, as I discovered, Nketia played a leading role in Ghana's struggle for liberation. He was a founding member of the Institute of African Studies, pictured here with Kwame Nkrumah, had a major influence on people like Maya Angelou, Du Bois, pictured here. In fact, the African American activist Maya Angelou acknowledged that it was Nana Kwame Nkrumah who insisted that she must write her autobiography, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. Thus, in my quest to understand who Nketia was, trying to understand his life with a broader question that animate my own project, what happens to anti-colonial ideas once an anti-colonial government falls, brought me to this philosophy of Nkrumahnism. Nkrumahnism is a political ideology that sought African independence through continental and diasporic unity, drawing on specific African approach to socialism, Pan-Africanism, and global anti-imperialism. Nkrumahnism emphasized shared political and economic structures to resist global white supremacy. Nkrumah believed that African intellectuals had a duty, a responsibility in challenging the ways that Europe had constructed Africa and the ways that it had used colonialism to justify the continual exploitation of African peoples. Thus, my core book project examines Ghanaian intellectuals who work to transform and radicalize the study of Africa and its diaspora in academic and intellectual centers around the Atlantic in the post-Nkrumah era. Therefore, through a thorough study of their scholarly trajectories, my book explores how Nkrumah's overthrow affected the trajectory of Nkrumahnism, a strain of Pan-Africanism and an ideology for African decolonization. In this way, I highlight how and why anti-colonial and decolonial ideas emerged, as well as how insurgent ideas were sustained after the collapse of a radical government during a period of rapid decolonization from the 1960s to the 1980s. Drawing on a rich archive of university records, historical newspapers, oral histories, and international organizations from Ghana, Senegal, the US, the United Kingdom, Grenada, Brazil, and elsewhere, I argue that Kwame Nkrumah's overthrow did not simply herald a period of decline and stagnation for radical Ghanaian thinkers. Instead, it marked a moment of grassroots transformation and revolution, ushering in a dawn of innovative political and academic initiatives in America and the Americas, and as well as the African continent. Their stories of these intellectuals and their pursuit shatter a specter of Afro-pessimism, for they stand as living testaments of the enduring resilience lineage of the Black African radical tradition. This tradition stands as a reservoir of wisdom from which African peoples can draw, a source of knowledge to confront the present political, economic, and social challenges of their time. Thus, the book is not simply about decline and de-radicalization. It's about how radical energies move in different directions and how people channel those energies for various liberatory causes. The book seeks to make three major interventions in the scholarship. First of all, it rethinks how we think about Ghana's role in Pan-Africanism. For many people know the story of Pan-Africanism as it moves through North America, inclusive of the Caribbean, from Europe to Africa, post-1945, and the strong roots it takes in Ghana. But for most, the story ends there. However, I argue that Pan-African intellectual activism continues to move, especially through academic channels out of Ghana to the US, then back to the Caribbean and South America, and eventually resurfacing in Ghana, particularly in the 1970s. I make the argument that African history, by default, is global history. That in order to understand Ghana's history and an extension of the continent's history, one has to be attentive to the global processes that shaped and continue to shape the continent's transformation. At the same time, my work adds to how we think about Black internationalism. For a lot of scholars who work on Black internationalism, they have focused on the movement of African Americans from the US to the continent of Africa and the ways in which they contributed to liberatory practices, state building on the continent. However, my work seeks to rethink that positionality and center Africans who travel the opposite direction, coming to the Americas and providing important ways of thinking and how to confront the imperialist project. The book is divided into 7 chapters, but for today's conversation, we will be zooming in to chapter 6. Before we continue, I want us to take us back to Ghana. Ghana was known as the Gold Coast, which was a formerly British colony. And its Pan-African leader and future president Kwame Nkrumah was shaped by his global sojournings. Nkrumah attended Lincoln University in 1935, an all-Black university. While living in the US, Nkrumah experienced racism that forced him to think about the conditions of Black Americans as parallel to the conditions of those he left behind in the Gold Coast. Thinking in these global terms influenced Kwame Nkrumah to organize the 5th Pan-African Congress. Unlike the previous Pan-African Congresses, the 5th Pan-African Congress moved away from its elitist orientation by including trade unionists, students, activists, revolutionaries, and making the argument that the fight for liberation had to be fought on the continent, and the Africans had to demand for immediate independence. Nkrumah, by 1947, returned to Ghana, joins the first political party by the name the United Gold Coast Convention in 1947, founded August 4th. Through his endeavors with UGCC, Nkrumah was jailed for his political colonial agitation. While Nkrumah was jailed, the country was engulfed in political protest, forcing the hand of the British to organize an election. Hence, by 1951, Kwame Nkrumah was released from prison and elected as the first prime minister of the Gold Coast. From 1951 to 1957, Nkrumah will work with the colonial government to transition the Gold Coast from a colony to an independent sovereign nation. Ghana's independence on March 6 ruptured the colonial racial order that sought to put Black people at the bottom. And in Nkrumah's words, after all, the Black man is capable, demonstrating that he's capable of leading their own and managing their own affairs. Witnessing this particular moment was Martin Luther King Jr., pictured above with Kwame Nkrumah. MLK, witnessing this particular moment, recalled, he stated, Before I knew it, I started weeping. I was crying for joy, and I knew about all the struggles and the pain and all the agony that these people had gone through for this moment. For so many people, like Martin Luther King Jr., W.B. Du Bois, whose passport was seized by the American government for his anti colonial activities, moved to Ghana. Those from the Caribbean, from the African continent, all of whom were fighting for independence, inspired by what Ghana had been able to achieve, went to Ghana. In the words of Kevin Gaines, Ghana had become the destination of radical hope for these revolutionaries. In 1961, Kwame Nkrumah aimed at transforming Ghana into the hub and the center for the intellectual decolonization of Africa, created the Institute of African Studies in 1961 and gave it a Pan-African mandate. Nkrumah urged the students and scholars at IAS to study the origin and culture of peoples of African descent in the Americas and the Caribbean and seek to maintain close relations with their scholars so that they may be cross fertilization between Africa and those who may have their roots in the African past. However, in 1966, Kwame Nkrumah, while traveling outside of the country on a peace mission, was overthrown in a military CIA-backed coup. So many people, the coup marked a significant moment of rupture. At the same time, people took to the streets rejoicing of Nkrumah's overthrow. Following Nkrumah's coup, the political climate in the post-Nkrumah era became very dangerous for those who had been affiliated with the Nkrumah regime. The military regime that came into power under the National Liberation Council, the NLC, vilified, persecuted, and deported, as well as imprisoned those who had been affiliated with the Nkrumah's government. They passed a law to imprison anyone who was seen as holding Nkrumah's images. They organized bonfires, burned books on Nkrumah's political party known as the Convention People's Party, and Marxism. They banned the CPP, expelled Nkrumah from the Ghana Academy of Science. In fact, there was a backlash against leftist ideas across various universities and institutions in the country. Pictured here is Ayikweyama, whose book, The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born, was used by the military government to justify their own brutality. In fact, they wanted Ayikweyama to take a loyalty oath. However, he resisted, and in so doing, they dismissed him from his job at the University of Ghana. Ahmed's experience thus illustrates the extent to which the LLC not only vilified, persecuted, and deported and imprisoned many scholars and activists close to the Nkrumah regime, but also harassed critics of Nkrumah who were not insufficiently supportive of the new regime. Additionally, the Institute of African Studies that Nkrumah had created came under direct government attacks. The new government also closed the Kwame Nkrumah Ideological Institute, which was aimed at promoting socialism and supporting African liberation. The Ghanaian professor and journalist Kwame Kakari recalled that when he arrived at the training college, the Kwame Nkrumah Ideological Institute, which had been transformed into a training college, that he and his colleagues could still see the compound burnt books. He argued people went to the library of that ideological institute and took out books from the library and burned them on the compound, just as they went around collecting any materials that had to do with the CPP, Workers' Brigade, Young Pioneers, and all those institutions, and burnt them in public bonfire. Based on what was happening, the terror that ensued after Nkrumah's overthrow, the demonization of anything that had to do with Nkrumahnism, and the onslaught on those affiliated with the regime for scholars of Africa and Pan-Africanism, for Black revolutionaries watching outside of Ghana. This moment marked a significant moment and an end to Ghana's radical tradition. In fact, the Africanist intellectual Jean Ullman captured this moment eloquently when she stated that when the revolution and all that was promised failed, the multi-sided struggle to recapture, reconfigure, or perhaps simply to decolonize African studies lost its center, its magnetic core, as it splintered into 1,000 fragments. For these scholars, Ghana's end shifted the attention from the Black Star to other places like Nyerere's Tanzania, Guyana's Burman's Guyana. However, my research reveals that Ghanaian intellectuals not only promoted the intellectual and political project of Pan-Africanism, they also helped to adapt these ideas to new contexts, and in so doing, they helped reorient and build Black Studies programs in the United States, further decolonial efforts in the Caribbean, supported efforts to build racial awareness in South America, and those who remained in Ghana kept Nkrumah's vision of a decolonized African studies in Ghana alive. The story of these Nkrumahist intellectuals sit at the crucible of significant global events. Their lives span continents and bore witness to a turbulent era of global history. In Africa, they saw the wave of decolonization, the rise and fall of radical African leaders, and the ascent of military rule. In the United States, they watched the transformative march on Washington, the surge of Black power, the assassination of President Kennedy, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King Jr., as well as the landmark milestone of the 1964 Civil Rights Bill and the 1965 Higher Education Act. Across Latin America, they saw the surge and the rise of military regimes, the increased persecution of Afro-Brazilian intellectuals, the propagation of economic dependency and underdevelopment theories. Meanwhile, in the Caribbean, they observed the echoes of decolonization, the rise and fall of radical leaders, and the wave of Black power movements. Amidst the relentless trials, the ceaseless uncertainty, a powerful force bounded these scholars together: hope. Hope fortified their spirits, granting them the audacity to persist. Having to view the outside world through the narrow openings of a barred prison window during the struggle for Ghana's independence put no limits on Nkrumah's capacity to envision a greater future for himself, the people of the Gold Coast, and indeed the world. Nkrumah dared to imagine Africa's decolonization at a time when most European leaders agreed with British Colonial Secretary Lord Carbon's assertion that most African colonies will, quote, probably not be fit for complete independence for centuries. If Nkrumah dared to dream of Africa's decolonization within those shallow walls, then these Nkrumahist intellectuals believed that even if they felt trapped, they could still use their platforms, positionalities, and skills to build a world where everyone was treated with the same dignity and respect and end gender and economic inequality. Hope fostered a profound sense of kinship among them. It assured them that if they persisted in their quest for liberation and emerged from the ashes of colonialism, Africa and its people would truly stand free. They carried with them the aspirations of their forebears, chanting to the winds, Africa for Africans, l'Afrique pour l'Africains, Africa para Africanos. They proclaimed with an unwavering conviction wherever they went, a luta continua. Victoria is certain. The struggle continues, but victory is certain. This was not a blind optimism, but it was rooted in the Black African radical tradition. This group of Ghanaian scholars contributed, elaborated, and tested Nkrumahist ideas and ideals. While African studies, as a liberatory Pan-African intellectual and political project succeeded in certain places at different moments, it did not always succeed in Africa or elsewhere. At times, and due to their diverse backgrounds, a traditional chief, a playwright, linguist, a novelist, an economist, and several social scientists, and their experiences, these intellectuals diverge on how to decolonize the study of Africa and eliminate colonialism and imperialism and their vestiges from the world stage. Nkrumahist intellectuals like F. Sutherland and Anakob Dankitia argued that folklore, cultural, and linguistic work was the most effective tactic. Still, Doviafesi and Anani Zizinho contended that political and economic work alone would do the job. For these scholars, these options were neither or, but fluid and based on context. They debated whether being anti-imperialist preluded being an advocate for industrialization and capitalism. How these scholars worked through these tensions and debates in Ghana and through the African diaspora is the core focus of this project. So what happens to these Ghanaian intellectuals? For some, including Dovia Fassi, Nanakob Nanketia, and Anani Zizinho, they found themselves in the United States. And in the US, they helped reorient Black studies in the US. Within Black studies, they sought to interject an Africa-centered sense of what political education and political mobilization meant into the framework of Black studies. They worked to also make Europe's modern and ongoing economic exploitation of Africa, the persistence of white supremacy regimes in Southern Africa, and the ways the US supported these oppressive forces, a core part of Black studies. At the same time, they challenged their colleagues to think beyond Africa as this frozen entity that was no longer conducive or attached to Black liberation projects, and emphasized the need for Africans and people of African descent to come together to work to overthrow the forces of colonialism. One of these Nkrumahist intellectuals, Dovia Fassi, who I'll be talking about more today in connection to his contributions to the Grenadian Revolution, Afasi went to Achimota College in Ghana. It was while there that he also became enamored by Pan-Africanist in Ghana's own independence struggle. At first, he then came to the US to study at Clark University, where he studied history and political science. It was at Clark University that his interest and connections between Africa and the Caribbean emerged out of his friendship with Grenadian scholars and politician Rosemary McNear, who was his former classmate, introduced Afesi to Grenadian circles and inspired him to learn more about Grenada and its histories. Afesi then went on to study history and political science at Michigan State University. However, he did not finish his PhD as he was invited to join and form the Black Studies Department at UMass Amherst. For Afesi, it was more important to think about Black liberation because he saw Black studies as the intellectual arm of the Black Power movement. When he joined Black Studies at UMass Amherst, he stressed the need for Africans and African Americans to work together. At first, he joined the department in 1973, 1972, thereabout. And it was during this time where Angola and pretty much most of Southern Africa were still fighting for independence. Angola will not gain independence until 1975. As a political scientist, a political activist, Afesi saw the need to connect his intellectual work to the political realities of what was happening on the continent as well as around the world. He told his students and fellow activists that they have to consider that the fact is that Angola is not fighting Portugal. He's fighting a system. It is not just the South African white who's responsible for the dehumanization of the African. He's only part of a larger system. In other words, for the liberation struggle to be successful, it must be Pan-Africanized. Afesi also went on to use the student radio to discuss African liberation struggles and its international implication in a world where neo-colonial forces were still trying to assassinate African leaders, Caribbean leaders, and to still colonize much of the African diaspora and to retain its colonization and domination on the African continent. By the early 1980s, the international landscape of Black liberation was experiencing significant changes. Across Africa, the unfulfilled promises of independence paved the way for military coups, civil wars, and increased struggles against neo-colonialism. In Ghana, the 1966 coup against Kwame Nkrumah ushered in a series of political upheavals, culminating in the 1979 and 1980 coups that brought a new generation of left-leaning junior military officers and activist intellectuals to power, including Rawlings, who is pictured right here. Many of these insurgents sought to reassess Ghana's place in the global anti-imperialist movements. At the same time, in the Caribbean, a revolutionary ferment was gaining traction. The People's Revolutionary Government in Grenada, led by Maurice Bishop, and the New Jewel movement drew inspiration from African decolonization, Black power, and Marxist thought to challenge US imperialism and chart a path toward radical national development. It is within this rapidly changing political terrain that in 1980, Afesi arrived in St. George's, Grenada. As a guest of the Prime Minister Maurice Bishop, the Ghanaian professor was attending the commemoration of the first festival of the revolution. The PRG organized this event to mark the first anniversary of the overthrow of Eric Gary on March 13, 1979. The PRG had invited Afesi to participate in its conference in St. George's, Grenada. And the first viewed this celebration as an opportune moment to link the struggles for African liberation to the Grenadian Revolution and to further foment an African consciousness among the people. Indeed, Afesi was already doing such work in the United States, where he had developed a political education program for African and African American communities in the Amherst area. In his political lectures and writings, Afesi argued that the colonial oppression of Africans, especially those in Southern Africa who were still fighting for their independence, was part of a global struggle against colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. For Afesi, the Grenadian Revolution and the Ghanaian Revolution that occurred on June 4th that same year were part of a broader transnational insurgent movement aimed at addressing rising levels of inequality, corruption, poverty, and the onslaught of neo-colonial pressures. In both cases, young radical military officers sought to challenge corrupt and oppressive government officials and to drastically reorient their country's political, social, and economic trajectories. In Ghana, Flight Lieutenant Jerry John Rawlins led a group of soldiers to overthrow the government because they claimed that the senior officers and the government officials had looted the nation's resources for their own benefit at the expense of the poor. Similarly, in Grenada, Bishop and the members of the NJM ousted the Grenada's government ousted the Gary's government along the same accusation to pursue grassroots socialist political and economic objectives. For Bishop and Rawlins attended the Sixth Non-Aligned Movement Summit Conference in Cuba in 1979. For those in the non-aligned movement, they believe that the strength of the movement laid in its consistent determination to stand firmly, unequivocally, and unambiguously on the side of freedom, self-determination, and justice, and to stand equally firmly against alien domination, economic exploitation, colonialism, racism, fascism, and Zionism, to be totally and uncompromisingly anti-imperialism. The Grenadian Revolution and the Ghanaian Revolution were not only illustrated the interconnectedness of Caribbean and African liberation struggles, but also revealed the enduring influence of Nkrumah's Pan-African political vision. These revolutions marked a moment when leftist activists across the Atlantic with shared vocabularies of resistance sought to construct alternative futures outside of Western imperial dominance. Thus, Afesi saw in Grenada an echo of Ghana's own radical aspirations. The People's Revolution government viewed African decolonization as part of the global struggle for Black emancipation, and thus hosted several prominent African nationalists, including Sally Mugabe, the First Lady of Zimbabwe, Kenneth Kaunda, the first president of Zambia, and Samora Machel, the first president of Mozambique. Grenada's National Women's Organization sent money, clothes, and other resources to Namibia and Angola. The PRG also provided passports and financial support to members of the African liberation movements. Grenada gave $50,000 out of its $30 million national budget to support anti-colonial nationalists engaged in guerrilla warfare against South Africa. The African National Congress wanted Grenadian passports so that they could easily move in and out of different countries without South African intelligence and Western allies tracking their every movement. Both the British government and the American government labeled Nelson Mandela as a terrorist and the ANC as a terrorist organization. Bishop declared that Grenada joined the chorus of support for the liberation movement in South Africa, which sought to free Zimbabwe, Namibia, and the super racist basin of South Africa from the clutches of colonialism and imperialism. The PLG saw African scholar activists as crucial envoys in their campaign to substantiate their stance against imperial forces and to advocate for African socialism and Black liberation. As Bernard Coe, the of the Deputy Prime Minister of of Grenada noted, the visitation of African nationalists signaled to Africa and our peoples the centrality of Africa in our thinking and in our orientation. Afesi's own work in the Caribbean focused on three main intellectual projects. First, he stressed the importance of an activist approach to the study of African diaspora, one that situated the issues of European and North American economic exploitation, specifically in Grenada, within a broader context of capitalism. Second, he used his public lectures to provide Grenadians with updates on African political decolonization, especially in Southern Africa, and connected it to Grenada's fight against imperialism and economic neocolonialism. Lastly, he used the Heskevitz approach of highlighting African survivals to foster a sense of connections and belonging among Afro-Caribbeans and Africans. I firstly relied on these intellectual projects to argue that the most effective means through which Afro-Caribbean and Africans could liberate themselves from the yoke of colonialism and imperialism was through a united effort. Throughout his series of public lectures that he gave in Grenada in 1980, first he explained that the international implication of African liberation struggles and the need for Grenadians to see colonialism as a global project that required a joint resistance. Speaking at the 1980 PRG Symposium, Imperialism and National Liberation Struggle, Afesi argued, just as it was in Grenada and other Caribbean countries, the West was mainly interested in accessing Africa's natural resources for its economic benefits. For Afesi, the primary aim of colonialism, whether in the diaspora or Africa, was economic exploitation, challenging the notion that colonialism improved the human conditions of the colonized. He stated, if schools were built, it was because efficient exploitation necessitated it. If roads were built, it was because they were necessary for transporting the goods and products of the country out of the interior. If railways were built, he continued, they served as the economic needed to haul bulk goods to transport to the seaport. And of course, seaports were necessary for the transportation of raw materials and minerals to Europe. I firstly believed that the ongoing economic exploitation of Africa and Grenada showed the need for Africans and Grenadians to collaborate in their fight against imperialism. He argued that post-independence, Grenada had to confront the colonial legacies of underdevelopment and misunderdevelopment, which resulted in inadequate school system, water and electricity supplies, dependency on foreign foods, and non-existent healthcare for the poor. By underdevelopment, Afesi meant colonial economic policies that maximize the provision of European needs with the minimum necessary investment. Afesi defined mixed underdevelopment as a mode of development which was incongruent with the basic human needs of the colonized peoples. Similarly, he explained that underdevelopment and mixed underdevelopment also underpinned Africa's economic crisis. Moreover, he contended that the fight against economic exploitation became difficult when leaders of formerly colonized countries, including Grenada, whereby leaders like Arigari used their power for their own ambitions and kept the system of oppression intact. The fight against imperialism was thus, he argued, also a struggle against oppressive African and Caribbean leaders. Afesi was also committed to providing Grenadians with updates on the ongoing liberation struggles in Africa, especially Mozambique and South Africa, as part of his broader intellectual project of linking African liberation struggles to Grenada's fight against imperialism. Afesi argued that it was not an accident that knowledge about African history and cultures, news about Africa's fight against colonialism, and relations between Africans and peoples of African descendants were limited in Grenada. He contended that it was because imperial forces wanted peoples of African descent developing an African consciousness. Afesi thus used his presence in Grenada in 1980 to raise awareness of the liberation struggle in Africa, to challenge the Western press portrayal of African history and cultures, and to highlight the similarities and differences between Africa and the Caribbean. Because Grenadians were eager to hear news about Africa's independence struggles, Afesi's public lectures served as an important medium for broadcasting knowledge about Africa. In those lectures, he explained that Europeans deployed racist philosophies to defend their violent imperial conquest and imposed white minority rule in southern African countries. He asserted liberation requires not merely an end to white minority rule, but political economic reconstruction to give blacks, the vast majority, the people, access to the region's rich productive resources. In the 1970s and 1980s, John Venter, the former General Secretary of Grenada's Trade Union Council, and his fellow vice president, recalled fondly the popular slogan, "The African struggle is our struggle," circulating in Grenada. Mike Rene, a former secondary school teacher and activist in Grenada, also noted that the government has shown films about the in battles in Mozambique against Portuguese. For this reason, when Afesi arrived in 1980, Rene explained that people asked him to tell exactly how the so-called Bush Wars was going, what was happening, who was involved, and why they were involved. Rene explained that hearing it from the horse's mouth and free of Western propaganda and Western press was what Grenadians needed to continue to challenge anti-African rhetoric. Indeed, Afesi's lectures were part of the inclusionist project of raising African people's consciousness to see how potent Pan-African project was to disrupting Western imperialist agenda. A couple of days after the commemoration of the first festival of the revolution, Carlos Davis, Grenada's permanent secretary of the Ministry of Education, wrote to Richard Norland, the then Dean of Faculty of Humanities and Fine Arts at UMass Amherst, saying, "On behalf of the People's Revolutionary Government of Grenada, I would like to thank you for making available for us the services of Professor Dovia Afesi." She informed the Dean, Professor Afesi delivered a public lecture on the topic U.S. invasion in Southern Africa and has succeeded both in making the local population aware of the work being done by the University of UMass Amherst and in whetting the public appetite for fuller and more detailed discussion on the topic. Davis also wrote to Paul Pryor, the chair of the Afro American Studies Department, to inform him about Afesi's work in Grenada. Davis wrote, quote, Professor Afesi delivered a public lecture to over 300 people. He considerably impressed the audience with his facility in handling the subject matter and his ability to translate complex concepts into simple and compelling words. Because Afesi's lecture was well received by the government and the public, she wanted Nolan's and Purview's permission to allow Afesi to return to conduct a series of lectures on the history of African liberation struggles and United States policies in individual territories of Southern Africa. Such series of lectures Davis maintained would satisfy their desire to learn more about African affairs, thus promoting a Black political consciousness. This request reveals the impact of Afesi's work in Grenada. An amalgamation of internal and external factors finally brought an end to the Grenadian Revolution in 1983, especially with the US invasion that year. The violence and trauma that local inhabitants experienced significantly influenced public and scholarly discourse about the Grenadian Revolution. As Laura Lament beautifully articulates, the revolution that was once a source of pride was now a disgrace. A distinct sense of shame and trauma dominated its literary imaginary, shaping how the revolution has been remembered, ignored, and in some ways forgotten. During the invasion, American soldiers destroyed thousands of government documents in the unrelenting bombing of the small island. Additionally, US soldiers also seized thousands of documents which they brought back with them to the US. While I found some archival documents during my time in Grenada at the University of West Indies and the National Museum, I discovered that Grenada did not have a national archive and that the National Library had been closed for decades. Most archival documents on Grenada are either in the US or in Britain, a reminder of the violent legacy of colonialism and imperialism and how that legacy continues to shape the histories of formerly colonized societies. Watching from his home in Amherst, at first he expressed his frustrations with US media and American population because he viewed the US invasion as part of American imperialism. As the violence continued to unfold, Afesi offered public analysis on the US invasion of Grenada to various local televisions, programs, and channels. In an unpublished paper, he frantically scribbled his thoughts in his notebook, writing, quote, given the previous massive ignorance about Grenada and the given instance and often superficial education which the invasion engendered, one is tempted to ask the question, on what basis did so many millions of Americans decide to support or not support the Reagan administration massive invasion of a tiny poverty-stricken island whose population is overwhelmingly black? He asserted, for as I understand it, the people in a democratic society are best able to effectively discharge their democratic duties and responsibilities when they are educated about the issues and are knowledgeable about the facts and varying viewpoints and interpretation of these facts. He asks, in the case of Grenada, one wonders if the average American knew enough to make an independent, objective decision about a major policy embarked upon by his or her government. Afesi's sentiments and indignations were connected to his commitment to challenge American dominance, self righteousness, and white supremacy. His story illuminates how history is made and how it is remembered due to lack of archives and to the erasure of hegemonic neo-colonial forces like the US. The history of the Grenadian Revolution, especially from Gary's overthrow in 1979 to Bishop's assassination and the US invasion in 1983, is still not taught in schools. Through my interviews in Grenada, many people noted that the only time people spoke about the revolution was in October. They bemoaned the government's refusal to initiate public discourse surrounding the event. Ironically, they pointed out that the government had marked October 25th as a national holiday to commemorate the US invasion of their country. Furthermore, they lamented that while there was a monument in remembrance of Americans who lost their lives during the invasion, there's no monument that honors the lost lives of Grenadians. Afesi was among prominent African intellectuals, activists, including Kenneth Kaunda, Samora Michel, and Sally Mugabe, who visited Grenada during the tenure of the PRG. To date, the visits of Kaunda and Michel are well remembered in Grenada. Many Grenadians, in their commentary on Bishop's assassination, normally cites Kahunda's purports cautions remark to Bishop, admonishing him to keep his gaze on his feet and not in the air because his enemies were amongst him. In contrast to well-known African leaders like Kahunda and Michel, the impact of rank-and-file African intellectuals, activists like Afesi are mostly forgotten, at least by the leadership of the Ministry of Education, where he served as a consultant for the government on non-formal educational issues. Yet, Afesi is well remembered by non-elites like Michael Rene and Paulina Pomi, whom I interviewed in 2020. So, as I conclude, it is worth noting that uncovering Afesi's attempts to foment an African political consciousness enables us to see a moment in history whereby the revolutionary imaginations of Africans and Grenadians became linked in their pursuit of challenging colonialism, imperialism, capitalism, and white supremacy. Thus, as we think and we commemorate the 187 years after emancipation, we need to think through these interconnectedness as a way forward in this bourbon and unrelenting imperialist world. Thank you.
Thank you, Bryce. You know, as you speak about raising African consciousness, I think about the various people who are present in Grenada from the African continent right now, and I consider their time here, how it will contribute to raising African consciousness, because there are people here from Tanzania, Rwanda, Chad, Nigeria, Zimbabwe. There's the deputy chair of the African Union, all who presented today at the African Caribbean Trade and Investment Forum. And I would say that your work is a living testament of Black radical tradition, you know, and I also feel that Nkrumah would be proud of the work that you're doing, because you're connecting the African continent with the African diaspora and bringing scholars together and sharing information and also showing the ways that we're connected. I didn't know about Afesi. This is the first time I'm learning about Dovi Afesi coming to Grenada and contributing to, the intellectual growth of Grenadians and our connection with the African continent. And I would say your work is part of what fortifies our spirits. And I look forward to, greater connections. And your work is really a gift to us here,
For sure.
and I'm grateful for your contribution. That's all.
Thank you very much.
Well, Bright is a Grenadian now. He, deci- he decided that a couple of weeks ago in a conversation. He said, in fact, he said, anything that's happening in Grenada, count me in.
Yeah.
So, and this work proves it, right? Indeed, a beautifully rendered historical analysis of all of the ways in which African intellectual work continues to inspire work throughout the African diaspora in Grenada. I particularly just honed in, like the kids these days say, locked in to the idea of Face's public education work. This it's so important to think about the work that we're doing together here in the IPE as a continuation of a tradition of activist intellectual work that is so much a part of that Black radical tradition, that African radical tradition. And so that was just a beautifully rendered historicizing of all of the events that led to this encounter between these wonderful African intellectuals in Grenada. Yes, Judy, like Bright said in his presentation, still so much to excavate around these events and these intellectual intersections. And I know that there are people on the chat with us who are doing that kind of work and who have done that kind of work. I see Professor Mo Collins is with us, people like Martin Felix, my own PhD supervisor, Dr. Nalini Mohabir was on as well earlier. People like Tola Dabiri, who is also one of our collaborators who we've worked together with. And so from this evening's lecture, we see that, like Bright said, a luta continua, right? And in the context of ongoing, like it's a word I love to use with my students, ongoing settler colonialisms, ongoing imperialisms. It's important to remember that this is not just an historical fight, but a contemporary fight as well, even as we remember events that are happening in the Middle East, in Gaza. And as Bright highlighted, one of the mandates of non-alignment was anti-imperialism and anti-Zionism at the same time. So we're really grateful to be in this rich thinking together around all of these wonderful convergences of thought and activism. I invite you, audience, to pose your questions in the chat or in the Q&A, and we're going to get to one of the questions from Anne, who says, Nkrumah envisioned a united and self-reliant Africa free from neocolonial influence. And in 2025, with leaders like Ibrahim Traore championing Pan-African solidarity and a return to African values, do you believe that the continent is experiencing a revival of Nkrumah's ideals? What are your thoughts on these new convergences? Yeah.
Yes, that's definitely a great question. And that is something that I've been thinking about, especially the way that Torre has been portraying himself. I mean, a lot of people see Torre's move, his break, trying to break from France, right? Trying to see even the protest in Senegal a few years ago. I was actually in Senegal for protest, and 2021, you see a moment where people are thinking internationally, right? That that the struggles for African liberation, the struggles for independence, the break from colonial rule, from neo-colonial rule, is something that the youth have taken on. They're connecting it to what is happening elsewhere. Right? We saw in Nigeria the Ansar movement, where Ghanaians even joined in. So we definitely see in these moments of struggles, in these moments where the forces of imperialism threatening to cut off funded, threatening to remove any type of self-dignity for Africans. People are going back to Nkrumah's words and saying, how can we build a United States of Africa to be independent and not be dependent on the forces of imperial rule? So I'll definitely say we are living in these moments, right? I was very even excited. I was even in a conversation 2 years ago with the ambassador of Zimbabwe, sorry, the ambassador of Suriname. Well, we're having these conversations where people in Suriname are eager to hear what is happening on the African continent, to build a stronger relationship. So I'm even happy to hear what Judy was even talking about in terms of these collaborations that are now emerging. But we shouldn't just focus on the economics alone. Cultural role is significant in raising the political consciousness. It is the reason why Nkrumah even established the Institute of African Studies, that you have to understand the processes of colonial rule, what he has done to African peoples and their psychology. The economics alone is not devoid of cultural liberation. Hence, we are also seeing a new wave of a political cultural consciousness that is emerging from the Caribbean, even with the carnivals that we see in Grenada, in Trinidad and Tobago, as a form of political consciousness. And we have to tie it more directly to what was also happening on the African continent, and for Africans to also become aware of what their brothers and sisters are doing on the other side of the Atlantic to better form stronger political consciousness and alliances.
I love that. I also took note when you said that some intellectuals said, well, it's all about the folklore, like let's go to cultural production. That's where resistance lives. And others said, no, let's focus on the economic dimensions. Like that's what's going to get us there. And it's always a convergence of the two, right? There's always something. The work that you referenced earlier, the work of Professor Laurie Lambert, one of the things that she does is to think about how the official archives of the Grenada Revolution are limited in their imaginary of the revolution. And so the literary archive opens up all of these ways to think about different kinds of voicings of that time and that moment that are equally important to how we think about the revolution and remember it. So agreed. I was going to ask that question, but you got to it. You got to it. Thank you. Judy is gonna take the next question. Judy.
Right. And before I take the next question, Anne commented, speak, Dr. Gyamfi, economics alone. We also need to build defense.
Exactly.
Yeah. And Tesfa, you spoke about you referred to the excavation, the ongoing excavation that needs to happen, that Bright spoke of, and even referring to Dr. Laurie Lambert's talking about the archives. And I think about Bright reference to Grenada's library and non-existing archives. What it means for our own excavation of our history and the stories that we pass on to further generations.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I
So
know
there's
that
a
there are people on this lecture this evening who have done a lot of work within Grenadian society to reanimate the National Library, to advocate for the repatriation of archival material to Grenada, with regard to, I think about Angus Martin's work. The last time we commemorated the 40th anniversary of the Grenada Revolution, one of the things that he was very passionately adamant about was the need to repatriate those archives. And I know Dr. Merle Collins has been really instrumental in thinking about how we get the library back on foot. And like Bright said, a lot of maybe younger folks in Grenadian society are also very interested in that. Just recently, I saw a post on Instagram where one of our young architects had submitted a design for the new library. And so people are thinking about what it means to recover our histories in light of these absences, in light of these lacks that we're experiencing. So definitely a lot to chew on from our
There's
discussion.
something to be said, right, about when you go to the US, they have massive national archives to tell their own histories. When you
Mm-hmm.
go to the UK, same thing. But when you come to places like Grenada, even Ghana, there's the active destruction of these archives that we are not able to tell these histories, especially these interconnectedness. Because like I began with the Nakobnan Ketia, he's virtually unknown in Ghana. Because of his close affiliation with Kwame Nkrumah, his entire archives were burnt.
Mm.
It was trying to resurrect his story with the file that I found and just doing research brought me to the US, and I saw within this magazine at UMass Amherst that he had published a piece within that. And within the same magazine, there was Dovia Fessi, who I'd never heard of.
Mm.
A lot of Ghanaians don't even know of him. He had also published a piece about the implication of the African struggles internationally. So as I was piecing these two together, I then began to think about, whoa, these two find themselves at the heart of the Black Studies movement as founding members. But the literature on Black Studies completely overlooked their work. And as I was doing my research, that's when I realized I saw the photo with Afesi and Maurice Bishop. And I tried to connect, like, oh, what is going on? And I was able to connect with his family to get access to his personal files. That I saw the invitation for him to come and speak. And then I did some research at the University of UMass Amherst where I saw letters from Grenada talking about the lectures that he gave. But his story is completely lost because of the ruptures in these archives in Ghana. So as I looked at this wider project, it then hit me that we cannot understand, if we cannot get a fuller picture of the post 1966 movement if we end with Nkrumah's overthrow. But new archival materials, interviews, embarking on this journey open a whole different histories. That 1966 was not a moment of rupture. That it was a moment when these Ghanaian intellectuals, unknown to the larger world, began to find solace, collaborate with their fellow Caribbeans, their fellow Afro-Brazilians, to construct and push against the world and the onslaught of the neo-colonial forces that they try to navigate. That even when Ghana ruptured, they still continue the work. That even when Grenada's revolution came to an end, they kept finding the radical energy and space to keep moving. So as we think about emancipation, as he even highlighted with young people redesigning the library, there's a political consciousness that is emerging. That the words of Stokely Carmichael is finding fruition when he said the job of the conscious is to make the unconscious conscious. What gave me hope when I came to Grenada was how, although the government was not celebrating the Grenadian Revolution, we're not teaching it in the classrooms, but how teachers, how within communities, people are understanding the import of the revolution, that they refuse to let that energy, the ideas that accompanied it, die. So, what the revolution can teach us, connecting it with the same revolution that happened the same year in Ghana in 1979, to think about these connections, to think about people like Afesi, to think about even Salim Mugabe, who was from Ghana, who became the first lady, how the important role that she played in the Grenadian Revolution. Because one of the things that people are not even aware was that the New Jewel movement, the newspapers, because when they had not come into power yet, they were able to get the papers to England, London. And it was Salim Mugabe who was typing out and then distributing the revolutionary newspapers. And this I got from my interview with Bernard Code when I had a conversation with him to think about these moments and these interconnectedness.
Right.
And I want to acknowledge the nonprofit Grenada Community Library that continues to keep the channels of information alive for the Grenadian community while we do not have the public library operating as yet. And I also want to say that some years and years and years ago, I studied I studied at the University of Ghana in Legon, and I had a professor called Kofi Awonor,
Yes, yes.
who when he asked me where I was from, um, it didn't take a second for him to start talking about Maurice Bishop and talking about the revolution, and it felt so good to me to be in Africa and somebody telling me so much about this place that I was born. So I just want to highlight that before I take Martin Felix's question, which is, are there ways in which African revolutionaries and in Nkrumahism, African revolutionary traditions presently coordinate across the continent to resist neo-colonialism? So African revolutionaries and Nkrumahism coordinating across the continent to resist neo-colonialism.
So that's a great question. And that's one thing that I hope when the book comes out, that when people are reading and people understanding these interconnectedness, because throughout the 60s and the 70s, it was very much present. But now we have work to do. And that is when history becomes critical. That is when the classroom, and by the classroom, I don't just mean the physical mortar of the universities, but rather the community, educating one another, reading the works of Nkrumah, reading the speeches of Maurice Bishop, reading Sankara and others, right, as well as being attentive to what is happening in Afro-Brazil, right, that finding ways to think about these things, learning about these histories, about these presents, will allow us to even delve in more deeply in building ties and awakening our consciousness. So presently, there are some groups Oh, they say they can't see my face.
Okay.
Oh, so as you know, presently there are some, I'll definitely say there's some people on the continent whose consciousness have been awakened, especially as we live in these times, these imperialist neocolonial forces. People are reading, people are coming to consciousness, people are building solidarities. So this is a very opportune moment. Social media and its ability to share knowledge is helping people to come together to learn what their counterparts may not know.
Thank you, Bright. We have one more question from Tonia Frame. I hope this is Tonia Frame, who used to be one of my besties in Chantimel School.
Nancy Miller.
I know, and that I saw yesterday on Dr. Bub so eloquently describing for us. It is. She confirmed it. Absolutely, it is. Dr. Tonia Frame, one of my old friends from Chantimel School and a public health advocate in Grenada. She writes, "Thank you, Dr. Gyamfi. This is food for our soul and for our continued awakening. The connection with our brothers and sisters on the African continent is long overdue. Based on your research and current events, what are some key lessons that we can learn to sustain this moment of the unification of Africans globally?" I think it's a wonderful question to end on. So, what are some lessons that we can learn to sustain this moment of unification of Africans globally?
This is a great question. One of the things that I have learned, especially following these intellectuals, including WFSC, who was the main focus, but other intellectuals who I write about, including Nana Kobdankatia, Anani Zizinho, was the deep commitment by these people to learn about other regions where Afro Caribbeans, Afro Brazilians were living, and how they could connect those histories to their current conditions on the continent, by which I mean that there was an active learning among these people of raising political consciousness. Hence, one of the things that I've also learned was the value of history, that we have to value history within our own community. When people are trying to study history, for those of us in the US and elsewhere, people would tell you, why are you studying history? It is useless. It is pointless. Why are you studying literature? You should focus on becoming a doctor. You should focus on becoming an engineer. You should focus on becoming a lawyer. But while those occupations are important, we have to realize that it is not your doctors, your lawyers, or your engineers that are setting the agenda that influence and drives the world at IMF, at World Bank, at UNESCO, and all these other places. But rather, it is your social scientists, your historians, your humanities. They get to determine the curriculum. Thus, it is not surprising that even in the US, they abandon books on Black history. They're stopping the teaching of Black history. You ask yourself why? Because of the political consciousness that it raised. I once had a conversation with a fellow African who said that what if he does not see the point of even studying English literature? I told him I agree, but I have a question for him. Why is it that the Kenyan novelist Ngugi wa Thiong'o will write a novel and land him in jail? Why is it that the Nobel Peace Prize winner in literature, Soyinka, will write a play and end him not just in jail, but also in exile in Ghana? Because these histories, these cultures are critical in the way that we think about liberation. So going back to Kwame Nkrumah saw culture as an important first step in liberating the mind of Africans, echoing the words of Bob Marley, who was channeling Marcus Garvey, that emancipate yourself from mental slavery. So my biggest lesson I've learned is how we value our own history and the extent to which we will go to learn about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Bright. Bright, your lecture this evening brought up for me, and we've had this conversation before, such a range of book titles that I had forgotten from my father's shelf. Weep Not Child. The Man Died by Wole Soyinka. The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born. Just realizing how much of that has influenced and colored my own intellectual formation from childhood, and how people of my father's generation who were very connected to processes of revolution and revolutionary consciousness and thinking in Grenada were in fact in conversation with these African thinkers and intellectuals, and just it was such a wonderfully rich reconnection. I remember reading Weep Not Child as a child, and just and finding these people. It's wonderful. It really warms my scholar heart. You mentioned UNESCO in a bit of a mode of critique just now in your answer to think about how these organizations do a certain kind of work in the context of development and so on. But one of the things that has recently come up from UNESCO is the idea of the decade, this is the second one, the decade of people of African descent. And UNESCO itself has a History of Africa book series that it's, as you were speaking, of course, and connecting with these book titles led me down a little bit of a rabbit hole of the Heinemann African book series and all of that, and just realizing how much of those books are out of print completely, and how much, again, when we talk about archival loss, how much we have lost as a result of that. And thinking about UNESCO kind of relaunching a History of Africa book series, and the UN explicitly stating that we are inaugurating the second decade of peoples of African descent. Do you see any ways that these kinds of initiatives offer us a chance to strengthen our enlightenment of Africa, to strengthen our diasporic connections? Give us some comments on that.
Yes, definitely. Because in my chapter 3 of the book is focused on UNESCO. So immediately after Nkrumah was overthrown, Nana Kobnan, who I cited earlier in the beginning of the talk, had gone on a UNESCO mission where UNESCO had hired him to travel around Latin America and the Caribbean and to come up with a conference for dialogue between the two regions. In his report, he detailed how he was shocked about the transformation of culture. For example, he was in Suriname at one point, and when he was at Suriname, he began to hear certain songs. He ate certain food that his grandfather, who was a chief, had taught him, but was no longer in existence in Ghana. So he writes that as part of UNESCO. So UNESCO, although can be seen as a tool or an institution of imperialists, these same tools, these same institutions can be tools for liberation, where African intellectuals and even Africans and people of African descent now can use to push through our history and to challenge the racist foundations upon which UNESCO's own humanitarian project had emerged. So Nketiah used his work in UNESCO to both critique the institutions, but also as a way to then push for African peoples around the diaspora and those on the continent to even build stronger cultural alliance. So this is a fine, it's an opportune moment for us to also take advantage of that.
This is something that we're thinking very deeply about in Grenada, as we think about how to mobilize these moments to raise consciousness in the tradition of Stokely Carmichael. Bright, I just want to thank you so much again for what is always a beautifully rounded, warm intellectual exchange. You are both simultaneously a detailed, careful historian and a beautifully warm and engaging presence. I've told you before that my sister, who will not really listen to anything intellectual that I'm involved in, says, "Well, if Bright is speaking, maybe I'll join in." So that's a testament to just the great job that you do with and for us in this arena, and we're very grateful for you. We, like you said, you can't get away from us now. You're a Grenadian now, so we're gonna be calling on you. We are very heartened to be in a moment where, like Judy described earlier, these connections, these reconnections are happening. I read this morning somewhere that there was a flight from the African continent to Grenada, the first of its kind.
Yes.
And so there's a lot happening there in within narratives of development and so on. And we continue to raise the urgency of intellectual work and cultural work that works in tandem with these other sort of more economic narratives. So we are, Martin Felix says, what a brilliant presentation by Brother Gyamfi. I will go back to it and take note. Thanks a million. Thank you, Martin, for that very generous comment. Right there. Judy, you anything to say to close off?
Well, I would say that Bright, you and your work are an illustration of Nkrumah's mandate to maintain close relationships with scholars in the diaspora, as evidence of your presence with us this evening in Grenada and everywhere around the world that people are logged in from. So we thank you for your work, and we look forward to engaging with you further and soon into the future.
And you referenced her work a couple of times, and I referenced her work, and I am very pleased to announce that next year's Emancipation Lecture will be keynoted by Dr. Laurie Lambert herself, an associate professor of African and African American Studies at Fordham University, an interdisciplinary scholar working at the intersection of literature, history, and in African diaspora studies. She is the author of Comrade Sisters, an excellent book that traces the sort of literary imaginaries around the Grenada Revolution from a feminist point of view. So I urge you to come back next year and be with us. I know Dr. Lambert is going to put on an equally engaging and wonderfully rich presentation as we commemorate Emancipation 2025, like Judy said, for the first time on Emancipation Day itself, August 1st. We remember all those who have come before us. We remember that emancipation is a long durée, like Ronaldo Walcott says, it's a long emancipation, but that work like this is what keeps us going. Work like this is what reminds us that we all have work to do in solidarity, in community, with each other, with family, with friends, with intellectuals, in the grassroots, that this work continues. And we thank everyone who has been with us this evening, everyone who stayed through the whole thing, all of our panelists, all of our attendees, all of our participants. Thank you for all the hearts that are floating on my screen and the clapping emojis, the applause. We look forward to hosting you next year for our 2026 Emancipation Lecture. I am your moderator, Tespa Peterson, on behalf of Judy Antoine, Brad Gyamfi, the Institute for People's Enlightenment, URI Global Campus, and Warm of Caribbean Freedom Fighters. It has been our great pleasure to host you this evening. Thank you, everyone.
Tout moun bizwen pou chanje, ki sa tout Grenadian pou chante, 1838 a ou yon, slavaj la Grenade nou jete, slavaj la Grenade nou jete, slavaj la Grenade nou jete, 1838 a ou yon, slavaj la Grenade nou jete. Le ka ale pou de sièk, Emancipation te ouvert, nous crier pour tout Grenadien, célébrer émancipation, respecter émancipation, raconter émancipation, nous crier pour tout Grenadien, venir célébrer émancipation.